Great. Well, welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Julie Rouge. I am faculty and the Associate Dean here at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation today with you, thinking about contemporary community conflict resolution. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in just a second because I'm actually curious who's in the room. I have a presentation that I will do, but I'm also interested in us having a conversation. So it'd be helpful for me to know kind of who is here. So let me stop sharing for just a second. And I'm just going to ask folks if you can introduce yourself briefly with just maybe what connection you have to the Carter School and if you've had any experience working in communities on conflict. So I'm just going to go in the order I kind of have on my screen. So Chad, could you introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can, thanks.
Okay, perfect. My name is Chad Klein, he, him. I'm a first semester grad student here at the Carter School and just grateful to be in the room and get to experience some knowledge from you guys. So thank you.
Thanks. Dan, I think you're next on my list.
Hello, I'm Daniel Rothbard. I'm faculty here and community conflicts. I have been involved in community conflicts overseas, not locally. So I don't know if that counts, Julie. But thank you so much for organizing this. It's a great topic.
Great, thanks. Georgia, I think you're next on my list.
Hi everyone, Georgia Hanforth, she, they pronouns. I'm a Carter School alum from the master's degree, graduated 2020 into the pandemic. Have experience with intentional residential communities in the US and sort of working with groups of people who choose to live together, choose to self-govern using kind of consensus-based process. So I grew up in those communities and I still facilitate meetings for them.
Thanks. Honore, and please, if I didn't pronounce a name right, please correct me. I want to make sure I try to get them right. All right. Let me go to Kayla. Kayla, can you say hi?
I can. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
Hi there. Good afternoon. My name is Kayla Owens. I am, maybe most importantly, a student of Dr. Rothbart. I am also a second year PhD student at the Carter School. I also work full-time, so please excuse my camera not being on. This is my lunch break. But I also work with community conflicts with the Department of Justice Community Relations Service. I'm a consultant in that federal sector. A lot of my disciplines and concentrations involve community conflict, such as womanism and reparations, as well as race relations in the United States. So that's where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for being here on your lunch break and giving up your lunch break. Kristen, introduce yourself quickly.
Sure. Hello, my name is Kristen Fagan. I'm a student at the Carter School. I'm in class with Chad and have had the opportunity to work with Julie on some community conflict projects recently. So excited to be here and talk about it.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Kristen, for being here and weighing in too. Laura, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So my name is Laura. I'm in the dual degree program. So I'm earning a master's degree in social work and conflict. I am halfway through that process. I have a history working as a social worker in New Jersey, and I have a background in crisis management, specifically psychiatric substance abuse crisis management. So I was just kind of interested to see, as I make my transition in my career, what this is like.
Cool. Thank you. Lydia, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Lydia Koltai. I don't have a connection to the Carter School, but I am an activist and helping to work on a youth diversion program. So I'm interested in conflict management, both within activist communities and the broader community.
Awesome. Thanks, Lydia. Molly, and if what we're doing for introductions is just who you are and connection to Carter School, and if you have a connection or if you've had an opportunity to work with communities on conflict. So for as I pick people up who I think have come in a little later. Olivia, could you introduce yourself?
Olivia Berry. I'm also in the class with Chad and Kristen. I am a first semester grad student in the conflict program. I guess for a community conflict adjacent area I used to focus on was disaster relief with FEMA via AmeriCorps. And we did see some conflict type of issues in that. And yep.
Thanks. And I realized that Molly, I said your name and then I skipped over you when I came back to it. So Molly, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. I'm Molly O'Donnell, and I'm the Director of Operations at the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago.
Awesome, thanks, nice to have you. Patricia, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Patricia Rodriguez. I'm about a third of the way through the master's program here, and I'm still trying to determine what my path is afterwards. So I'm just kind of gathering information and seeing where I want to go with it.
Awesome, thanks. Rifa.
Hi, my name's Rifa Moeen, and I am a freshman at George Mason with a minor in conflict analysis.
Great, nice
So
to
I
have you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't experienced much yet, but I'm excited to learn and get to experiencing new things.
Awesome, glad to have you. And I just lost somebody who, Erin, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. Sorry, I started speaking on mute. My name's Erin McPhee. I'm a scholar in residence at the Carter School and also the principal investigator for the Trust After Betrayal project, which is looking at how formerly armed actors from groups like gangs, cartels, and insurgent groups remake their lives in the communities after they've participated in those groups. And I look a lot at the topic of trust building.
Awesome, thanks, Erin. Ashton, could you say hi?
Hi all, I am Ashton. I'm a second year PhD student at the Carter School, and I look at hyperlocal conflict around transportation in urban areas. So how communities make decisions about transportation investment and infrastructure, which in DC, where I live at least, is a very hot topic whenever you talk about bike lanes or bus lanes or pedestrian improvements to our sidewalks. So I look forward to this session.
Got it, awesome, thanks. Avery, you want to say hi?
Hey y'all, I'm Avery. I'm the new recruitment coordinator and advisor for the undergrad side of Carter, and I'm currently getting my master's in religious studies with a focus in peace and conflict resolution. So excited to learn more.
Awesome, thanks. I think I got everybody. If I didn't, can you just put either your virtual or if you have your screen on, your hand up so I make sure I come back to you. Oh yes, okay, Deborah, perfect, thanks. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Deborah. I use she, her pronouns. I teach conflict resolution at Columbia, and I work at Hebrew Union College in higher education. I'm a newly admitted PhD.
Awesome.
Student, and I've worked in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the community level. So I'm excited to learn more.
Great, nice to have you. And Sunghyun Lee, do you want to introduce yourself? You had dropped off, but I think you're back. Okay, there might be some audio problems happening. Well, let me go ahead and get started. I've put together maybe 45 minutes of a presentation looking at some of the community conflicts that I've been working on, but then I'm hoping to open this up for a little bit of a conversation with you all, because I think this is I think many of us are in many ways kind of by default finding ourselves working on these issues. As you know, this year, this Peace Week theme is what works, building peace at home and in the world in challenging times. And we are recording the session, so just to have that as a heads up. But to give you a little background on how kind of I got here. So As I said, I'm faculty at the Carter School and an administrator, but my original work was actually looking at extremist groups and how we talk about violence by extremist groups and what their connections are to the local communities that they're a part of. But that was predominantly outside of the US, right? So doing research on terrorist groups, around the world in a variety of different settings. But really over the last 10 years, maybe pretty heavily in the last 5, it became increasingly apparent that we had lots of requests and lots of folks coming forward asking for help to deal with issues here in the local community. And for a variety of reasons, I got pulled more and more into that. And just to maybe kind of say something about the role that I see for myself, there's lots of different roles that we can play in thinking about conflict resolution. The role I'm going to be talking about predominantly here is playing the role of a process design or process facilitator. And I just make that distinction because we have lots of folks in our community who care a lot about doing the activist or the advocate part of the work, right? Of getting out there, raising issues, being in contact with their council members and their elected officials to try to get change made. And that's a really, really important role. And it's different than the role that I have seen myself playing over the last 5 years or so, which is of trying to set up processes that allow communities to make collective decisions together about how they want to move forward on really tricky issues. And that the role that I'm playing is trying to help them come to decisions for themselves, right? So it isn't, and those two roles are complementary. In a lot of ways, we wouldn't get to the point of having community conversations around making real policy changes if people hadn't been activists and advocates and raised the issues and had elected officials recognize they need change. But it's not the same role. So just to be clear that the role I'm talking about is really around that facilitator, the convener role, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So just because it is a little bit, it is a little different space. Let me go back to sharing my screen if I think I can. And I'm just going to talk a little bit, and I'm really glad Kristen's here. And Kristen, feel free to just kind of unmute and weigh in or send me a signal, because Kristen's been involved in a lot of these processes, as have a variety of Carter School students and alumni as we've gone through them over the years. So I wanted to talk about some of the principles that I kind of see at work here, some of the research that other people have done, and then some of the work we've been doing, if I can make it do that. And actually, maybe I should say greetings from Malta. I'm here teaching in our dual degree program. So we may have some other time zones at play here, but I appreciate everybody spending the afternoon there. So Carpenter and Kennedy, and this was in 2001, but they put out a book called Managing Public Disputes. And I think this is an interesting frame, right? Because what we're thinking about is what are the conversations that are happening in public spaces that have some characteristics that kind of make them a little bit unique. So, think about, and this is, they're not new. I mean, these public disputes have existed forever. Georgia, I think, was talking about the bike lanes and transportation, right? We think about public disputes when we're thinking about how do we manage resources and where does that power plant get put into place, or where does how do we use land use or zoning, all of those kinds of questions. The public disputes, I think, that we have seen increasingly having the attention to be handled, though, over the last decade, have been much more about underlying issues of race, equity, justice, and they tend to be the issues that can't just be negotiated, right? This isn't just a matter of finding a technical solution to put the issue, figure out where the best place is to put that particular water infrastructure or the best place to put that transportation project, though recognizing that all of those have other values pieces to them. But really thinking about these public disputes as being really complicated, thorny kinds of problems that we're trying to figure out how to work with. There's a couple of reasons why they're thorny, right? Is that we have complicated networks of interests. As a dispute emerges and moves, you have lots of new parties that come into play. We're talking about communities where you have lots of distribution in how much expertise and power people might have. So you may have people with formal power, you may have people with kind of the power of the pulpit or the power of the press. You may have people who don't really have much power in these situations at all, but are very directly impacted by them. And that's something that we really needed to pay attention to, I think, as conflict folks, as we look at this. Often these disputes are arising where you may not have pre-existing relationships amongst the disputing parties. So whether it is, I've been following pretty closely recently, the missing middle conversation in Arlington, right, where you have a set of communities who previously, who are advocating for different kinds of housing that don't have a history of kind of working together across those issues. And there's often different decision-making procedures, and people have quite different knowledge about how decisions are made. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with kind of parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order and kind of how our legislative systems work. Those are systems that are not designed to facilitate conversation. They are systems that are designed to manage process, manage conflict, and manage decisions, and to eliminate or lessen the conflict around the process, right? But for me, as someone who does conflict resolution, is interested in us having hard conversations well, many of those decision-making structures are inherently kind of antagonistic to the idea of having a hard conversation in a way that the public really engages in. So I think that's important as well. We also, in a lot of these cases, may have procedures that are not standardized or not know who gets to make the decision. So I'll talk a little bit later about a process in Fairfax City that we worked on that took a really long time. But one of the questions that came up is there was a lot of clarity about who could make a decision on the street name, but who makes the decision on the name of the neighborhood that's on the sign when you enter it, if there's no formal homeowners or association, right? Who actually gets to make some of those decisions? What's the process? And so a lot of the contest can sometimes be around actually access to process and who's making it. And then we see these have lots of broad ranges of issues, and often there is a very unequal distribution of technical information around the issue. And I would throw into that since I think they wrote this set of list of issues, there's often now a lot of disagreement about what the facts are on the ground around a particular issue or how we got there. So I think that these are just really important as we think this through, and they put together, and this is a kind of a poorly done slide, but to give you a sense, this is their graphic of looking at how we go from what could be, what are problems that are emerging in communities to kind of explosions of violence, and where we have conflict dynamics that are just building, right? It's been amazing to me how invested and all-consuming some of these conflicts are to the communities and the activists and the parties that are in them. So I will send these slides out later. You don't need to pull this now or try to write it all down. We'll send them out to everybody who registered. But just wanted to kind of show that we really are. There's been some thinking about how do we get to the point that we are at the kind of escalated level that we can be about things that often might feel fairly straightforward. So for people who are working on these public disputes, these are a set of principles that Carpenter and Kennedy put forward, and in terms of thinking about how we manage them. And I think one of them is super interesting, is that to find a good solution, you have to understand the problem, which is not always self-evident, right? Trying to really dig into what are we contesting can sometimes be a little bit of an issue. And I will say that in all the process I think we're going to talk about, one of the first things that I do is usually hours of interviews with people who are involved on multiple sides of the issue. So with elected officials, with different party members, or different parties to the conflict, but really spend a lot of time on that intake process. And it's really important because trying to really get clarity on what the issues are we're talking about, and what are the range of issues, and what are the connected issues, and how is this being constructed is really important. Would also say that negotiation usually, or this process usually, means that we have to come up with a constructive definition of the problem. Many of these are equity issues. And so the definition of the problem that is being used in the community often is not constructive, right? So it has been framed as someone is being racist, or someone is not wanting to hold on to their power. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that get thrown into these conversations. And so figuring out how do we come up with a constructive definition of the problem that allows everyone to engage with it is important. Much of this, I think, is familiar for folks doing conflict resolution, but I would also maybe highlight two of the last ones. The process has to be flexible. There's an old kind of military joke that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. I would say the same thing about no process design fully survives first contact with the community, right? Like we get out there and we think we have this design and we'll have spent weeks on it and talked it through and shared it and had 1 million people weigh in. And then we get out and start to do it and we discover something that we didn't know, or there's a different dynamic. And so really thinking about where we can be flexible. Now, that doesn't mean you throw it all out. I've actually had several processes that I thought were just kind of running off the rails, and we just kept going with the design we had planned, and they came back. And so it doesn't mean that you just, you meet something and you're like, now I'm just going to wing it. But so there's this combination of, and I've heard Liz London, who does restorative circles, talk about this, but planning like heck and then going with the flow. So having some ability to be flexible. And then the last one is do no harm. And this is important because I do think that there are some of these processes, and I'll give an example a little bit later of one that when done actually can create more division in the community. And depending on how they're done and kind of what some of the outcomes are. And I'll give an example of one that I actually don't feel good about. I feel like left the community in a more divided state than we started with. So it's kind of just some ideas of kind of the public dispute space. This is work that I use when I'm teaching about this from a guy named Roger Schwartz, who talks about the skilled facilitator. And what I like about him is he's really doing thoughtfulness about kind of the underlying principles, beliefs, and values behind the kind of facilitation that I think I care about. And he sets up this set of roles and principles. And if anybody's interested, we have this as an ebook in the library, so you can grab it and pick it up. He works predominantly with organizations, but I think that this work expands out to think about communities. And I think, in what I've done, I found that at different times I'm sitting in some of these different roles. Sometimes I am a coach. Sometimes I really am working as a facilitator. Sometimes there's more mediation. So just to say that to see that there's a lot of different roles that I think we play, and thinking through what exactly is the role that we're playing in the conflict we're working on. But kind of philosophically, I want to maybe share that this is, I agree with his underlying definition of this. There are plenty of people in the world who are facilitators, right? Or process design folks. They do strategic planning, they're organizational development consultants, they're all of those kinds of things. And I think mostly they fall into this first role, right? This first category of the basic role of a facilitator, which is that, they're kind of framing what they do as being outside experts coming in to help a group with a process. And it's, they're getting paid to do it, which is great. I think people should get paid to do work, paid for the work they do, but they're really seeing themselves as being necessary and inherently necessary for these kinds of processes. And they take responsibility, and it's about them. I've been trying, not always succeeding, but really trying to function much more in a developmental role where, yes, we need to solve the problem. And yes, I am bringing outside expertise. And yes, all of the Carter School community who's coming with me to work on processes, bringing that expertise, but we're trying to build the expertise also. So we're co-creating with community. So often it means that I'll have someone who is in city government or in the local community who's kind of set up as a co-creator or a co-facilitator of the process, so that they're working along with us to do the design. Kristen and I are working on a process right now in a high school where we're working very closely with their equity team to help them build what they want to do and build their capacity. And the idea really is that we should be building capacity in these communities to take on the next issue better, right? So we may be there to assist with this one, but how do we help build that capacity for the next one as well? And I think that's an important distinction, because it moves us, I think, into the positive piece framing, that we're not just trying to deal with these issues. We're actually trying to help communities, groups figure out how they're going to do it better the next time. Let me go. All right, so I'm going to run through just a couple examples of processes I've worked with and kind of some evaluation of kind of where I think they were. And this first one was started by the county manager, and this is actually important if you're doing this work, is where the process is generated from in terms of if it's coming from elected bodies or it's coming from professional staff, because it changes some of the rules we have to work with in terms of public meetings and meeting the transparency requirements that go along with when processes are kicked off or sanctioned by elected bodies. So that's just important, and it can be a little in the weeds, but just to highlight it. But this was started in August of 2020. What I thought was interesting about this is that Arlington County, this is obviously a couple months after George Floyd was murdered, right? So there was a lot of pressure within Arlington County to look at how policing was being done, and in the frame of obviously this larger national conversation of the role of policing in our communities. What's also interesting about it, though, is that there hadn't been a specific incident. So in most of the cases, and I think, you know, in the work that Carla does as a conciliator at Department of Justice, those are situations where there's been an incident, right? There's been an incident of violence, someone's been killed, someone's been shot, and then people are coming in and doing the kind of the review under the standpoint of trying to fix acute harm that the community is reacting to. This was an interesting process because that wasn't the case. There hadn't been a specific incident. This was kind of more of a, which I thought gave us some space for conversation, because we weren't responding to an already super tense situation, though clearly there's tensions and clearly there have been harm, but there wasn't the kind of community heightened process. So there's two pieces to this. The first one on the top of the slide is that there was an external expert police reform human rights lawyer out of Chicago that came in and did some external assessment of policies and procedures compared to national best practice. And so she looked at the use of force, their training and supervision, cameras, both body cameras and dash cameras. At this point, Arlington County did not have cameras, which was actually a little surprising because I think most of the other jurisdictions around had them. What their processes were for recruitment and retention, how they handled internal affairs, complaints, but also collection of statistics, things like that, and then data. What I was a part of, and actually Susan Hirsch had a class, her law and justice class was a part of this as well, was actually working with a community stakeholder group that was about 20 community members selected by the county manager. They reflected a lot of different advocacy groups in the community. So we had like the vice president of the NAACP in this group. We had the leadership of NAMI, which is the National Alliance for Mental Health, I think. I don't remember exactly what the acronym is, but the mental health advocacy community. We had a variety of different groups represented, and we had 4 topics to take up with the stakeholder group and to come back and make recommendations on it. And these were first a civilian review board. So Virginia had just legalized, the legislature had just passed legislation allowing for civilian review of police departments, not sheriff's departments. And this is an interesting distinction, but of police departments, which previously hadn't been allowed. So the questions around this is, what kind of civilian review do we want? Who's on the board? Do they have subpoena power? Can they force the police department to turn over information? What are the powers that they have? The second was mental health and policing. And this was interesting because it was originally really started as a police response to mental health, very, very quickly expanded to a countywide social service response to mental health crisis. And the recognition that Northern Virginia is not succeeding in providing the kind of crisis mental health services. They don't have the number of beds, they don't have a whole lot of infrastructure. And so while we started from the lens of looking at policing, very quickly, this subgroup really started looking at the broader mental health infrastructure, including for people experiencing homelessness and other things in the county. The third thing we were looking at was traffic, and this is traffic stops and how traffic is enforced, right? Are there other ways to do traffic enforcement with cameras or other things versus police stops? And this is really recognizing that, traffic stops are high risk. They're one of the highest risk things from a police department that you do as a police officer that you do, but we're also obviously seeing that they are high risk, particularly for communities of color. So this was looking at what are some of the mechanisms in which we're enforcing traffic and can we do it differently? And then the last one was looking at opportunities for alternative dispute resolution, diversion programs, restorative justice. The the new county Commonwealth attorney for Arlington and Falls Church was very interested in building and restorative practices. So, so the group was working on these 4 topics, but we also needed to do a lot of community engagement. So we had community learning sessions, and these were really interesting because what they did is they brought in experts or people who had engaged with these topics in other parts of the country. So there's a couple of interesting models in Seattle, for instance, of mental health response. There's a diversion program that's coming out of in Louisiana that's very interesting. So really bringing in models from around the country to share with the stakeholders, but also the larger community. And so these are all public presentations. People could come in and hear about what they were doing. So we brought in community learning sessions, and then we went and did roundtables, and we identified kind of who the stakeholders were for each of these different areas and did roundtables to get their feedback. So for instance, on the mental health roundtable, you know, we had advocates, but also people who had experienced mental health crisis in the community and tried to really bring in a wide variety of stakeholders. It was 2020 to 2021, so we were doing almost everything virtually, which, you know, had some advantages because we were able to bring in folks who probably wouldn't have been able to come to a 7 o'clock thing happening at, you know, the Arlington County Library or something, right? Because they were able to log in online. And so we worked through that process. So there were over 100 recommendations that ended up being made to the county manager and the county board. They have been, you know, adopted piecemeal, right? You know, they're all a little bit different in terms of how they go about being adopted. There is now a civilian review board in Arlington County that does have subpoena power. These recommendations were kind of put forward with information backstory, like lots of the report was quite lengthy, and the different subgroups really spent a lot of time putting thoughtfulness into the report and the recommendations. And we indicated where there might not always be agreement. So for instance, there was an agreement around the civilian review board and whether it should have a subpoena power or not. But they were pretty wide ranging and included both things the police would do, but also that the county might do or other kind of social services agencies might do. So for those of you doing the social work program, there was a lot of emphasis on how those other kinds of services might fit in here also. So that was one kind of process, right? We had a lot of flexibility because it was coming out of the county manager's office. There was a lot of flexibility in design. We had students who were able to help with the stakeholder mapping. It was pretty robust, took about a year to do and then to get it in the budget process. That was followed up by a request from then the school board, Arlington County Schools. The chief of staff of the schools called me and said, we need to make some decisions. There's a lot of outcry about the role of having uniformed police officers stationed in our schools. School resource officers, so school resource officers are usually armed, sworn uniformed police officers who are stationed kind of permanently in schools. They go back to the 80s, 70s, 80s. Originally were I think implemented as an effort in kind of the say no to drugs, you know, gang prevention and drug prevention in schools. You know, there's a lot of concern among certain communities that they are part of a school to prison kind of pipeline, that they are having things that should be happening within the school discipline system gets then moved into the criminal legal system, right? So there's some real concerns about that, particularly amongst some of the communities. There's also real concerns though, you know, and we just had the school shooting that happened this week, right? That having police officers in schools, there's communities who are very concerned that if you don't have police officers in schools, or that they are a tool to stop the kind of active shooter situation that we unfortunately are seeing way too often. So I think this was an area where people who had very different perspectives were trying to come together to have a conversation about this. So we created a group of 40 people applied to be on the stakeholder group. We created it was a survey or an application, and we made sure that we had variation in people's opinions. So about a third of the group came in thinking that school resource officers should be taken out of schools. About a third thought they should stay, and about a third were undecided. And so we had about 40 adult members. We originally had thought we would just have students on that group, but then kind of became clear that we needed to have a separate group for the students, with then the students advocating to the larger adult group. And as practitioners, I think is something for us to think about is how do we bring in youth voice in a way that those youth are, one, it's very hard for adults to just turn around and dismiss the voices of the people who are actually in these buildings, right? Who are the ones living the reality. But I think there's ways that we need to pay attention to how do we facilitate them being able to effectively advocate for what they're looking for, or what they want to see happen. Particularly, because you have such power differentials between the adults that are participating in these processes and some of the young people. So really thinking about how do we prepare them for that. And so in this case, what they did is the students then kind of created representatives who were able to then go speak to the adults on behalf of the larger group versus having it be kind of them speaking just on their own. It was a little tricky, but again, we had 4 subgroups, education and mentorship, looking at what we did, and I think this is really important, is that we didn't start the conversation by saying, should school resource officers stay or go? We started the conversation by looking at all the different roles that police officers were playing in the buildings. What are they actually doing? So you had softball coaches that were the school resource officers for the schools. You have, drug education classes that the school resource officers are handling. You have a whole set of different kinds of things that they were doing. And so we really went through and started to list all of those different roles, and then looked at, are those the appropriate roles for police officers to be playing? And what became pretty clear early on was that, one of the things that was happening is that you had police officers in the buildings who were a willing adult to help in a variety of different ways. And so a lot of the administration of the school, well, it was very school to school dependent on what kinds of things they asked the school resource officers to do. And you could tell the difference between administration that felt very comfortable with doing discipline and administration that didn't, of the schools. And that really impacted the roles that the school resource officers played. So we created this list across these different 4 subgroups too, and then identified if were police officers the right people to be filling those roles. What was the appropriate pieces of this for them to play, and then that led up to a recommendation, right? So the end of recommendation ended up being to not have school resource officers permanently stationed in schools, but to rework it as a youth engagement unit that is based out of the schools, but with the size of Arlington can be fairly rapid reaction. There was also a need, though, then to make a set of recommendations about how to fill these roles that they were playing in other ways, right? Who should be filling them, and that really looked at needing to have additional school counselors, social workers, those kinds of things that to take on those tasks and those roles that they were playing. I think it was really important as a process facilitator, though, that we didn't start with an up or down. We never voted. So when I went in to present this and the chief of staff came in, presented the recommendations to the school board, one of the school board members looked at me and he said, how did you get them to negotiate, or how did they negotiate this? And I said, well, they didn't negotiate. This wasn't a yes, no, this wasn't an up or down vote. They went through and methodically looked at very intentionally what the situation was, and then worked through that to come up with a recommendation. So it wasn't a horse trading, it was a recommendation. And that recommendation went forward with consensus. So it was a group recommendation. It wasn't that 10 people got voted down, right? It went forward with a lot of nuance and with a lot of information associated with it, and a lot of thinking, but went forward. And that was something that I think that school board member couldn't entirely understand. It's how we had gotten such a contentious issue to turn into one that the group was putting forward a consensus recommendation around. The next one, let me talk about, I referenced this earlier, Fairfax City came summer of 2020, asking if we could help them do a process to look at a couple different things. One was that there's a whole set of, as in Northern Virginia, anyone who's from Northern Virginia knows that you can't move 5 feet without stumbling over something named after a Confederate general or related to Civil War history, right? It's everywhere. And it's been a continuing conversation. And, this is happening right summer of 2020 when, in Baltimore, you had middle of the night people going and tearing down statues. You had just had the events in Charlottesville. with them, around what they were trying to take down. There was a conversation in Richmond about what to do with the statues in state capitol. But the three things that Fairfax City was really thinking about was monuments, markers, and memorials. If you walk through the city or did at the time, and you looked at a lot of the historic markers, I think that most people looking at them would think that they were really written as a pro-Southern, from a pro-Southern perspective. So we talk about the Union aggression, those kinds of things in the markers. So many of them written, several decades ago, and written from a particular perspective. So a review of those, as well as there was big markers in the cemetery. There's a section of the cemetery that's a Confederate plot, as well as a section where the Daughters of the Confederacy had put up a big obelisk. We're also interested in the names of streets, roads, and neighborhoods. So there was a couple dozen. The city's historical preservation group continued to work through this process of trying to identify, go back to the beginning of where these street names came from, and figure out where they actually, where the connection was, what were they named after. So you had, quite a few, the most of which were in a neighborhood called Mosby Woods, which is a subdivision that was built in the 80s, and it was actually designed by a Korean American developer who was putting in the subdivision and was looking for a theme. And Fairfax City is the home of Fairfax Courthouse, and there's a very famous raid during the Civil War by John Singleton Mosby, who was a cavalry officer, where he snatched a Union Army general out of his bed in the middle of the night in Fairfax Courthouse, and it's the thing, right? I think Mosby was probably, by all accounts, a war criminal. I mean, I think that there's some definite evidence of what he did to African-American Union soldiers and things like that. So I think that most people reviewing that evidence would think that he may not be someone that we want to name a community after, but this entire community was named that way. So this is the corner of Plantation Park Lane, Confederate Lane. There was Rebel Lane. There was Raider Lane after Mosby's, or Rangers. There was Raider. There was also a whole set of names that were associated with the movies Gone with the Wind, so Scarlet Circle and some things like that. So a lot of names. Now this community had been trying to make decisions about this. So this particular neighborhood at this point was just completely fractured between a set of people who wanted to make change and a set of people who had not, including, as I understand it, some threats that were made. And I mean, this has been boiling for a while. And so the city council wanted some help. And then the last thing we were looking at was the city seal, which still had a Confederate soldier on it. So every police car, every maintenance truck, every piece of official city business had a Confederate soldier on the seal. So this is what we were being asked to look at. And they recognized that these were the first kind of symbolic steps towards needing to think about a lot of deeper structures, but they wanted to take care of some of the symbols first. So this process was sanctioned by the city council. We had some city council members help us plan it, partnered with us and a group of students. It's actually Adina Friedman had a Conflict 625 course that was working on this. And we did a whole set. So we had a stakeholder group of about 16 people. This is one where I had an opportunity to really participate in the selection of that group. At one point, my wall in my office was covered in sticky notes trying to figure out how to make the perfect group that reflected a balance of roles and interests, as well as kind of demographics. Our youngest member was 15. Our oldest member was in their 70s, represented long-term history with the community. And then that group, we also had, while that group was working and they were doing the really difficult work of thinking through these issues, we also had a set of community conversations happening. And so these were, we brought in historians, we brought in experts on a variety of different topics to come in and talk about how we got to where we are. And then Adina's students led discussions, dialogues after each one of these sessions where we said, okay, based on this history, based on this topic, what does that mean for us in 2021? What kind of community do we want to be? And a set of really interesting discussions around that. So this is just some of the topics. They then put forward a set of recommendations to the city council, again, by consensus. So all 16 members signed on to a set of recommendations. And I thought one of the things that I thought was really important about this is there was, we didn't start with doing up or down votes. We started with conversations about what people valued in their community. How do you know that those values are being expressed? what does it mean? What are some of the symbols and ways you can see in your community that you belong or don't belong? And I think we were a month and a half, 2 months in before we actually asked for anyone to express a specific opinion about what we should do on any of these issues. So we spent a lot of time building the framework for them to decide. And I was one of the things that really made me very happy, I think at the end of it, the 16 of them presented their recommendations in person to the city council. And as they were describing the process, they talked about the change and the learning that they had done and how they had shifted. And so one person who came in quite not aggressive, but very, very not interested in making sweeping changes, right? Feeling like that wasn't something that was really important. He said, I've gotten the chance to hear people describe their lived experience of what it means to run cross country and to have your team run down Confederate Lane and turn on Plantation Parkway as a young person of color. And he's like, so while I don't necessarily think that these names are a problem, I don't want anybody in my community to feel that way. So I'm going, with this recommendation to make this change, even though for me personally, it's not the change I would put forward, but I really feel like I want members of my community to feel safe. And I thought that was kind of what we were hoping for, right? Was that people would learn and really hear each other and evolve their perspectives. And so it took a lot of time. And we were together a long time. And I did a fair amount of coaching outside of the process for individuals who were feeling a little bit challenged. They did make a recommendation. They were focused on values. So they decided early on that they had a real value for human life, individual human life mattered. So for instance, their recommendations in the cemetery were that if any of the markers were associated with individual people, they shouldn't be changed. But they did want to add some additional historical interpretation for like the Daughters of the Confederacy Memorial, that kind of thing. They made a set of recommendations around the markers as well. Recommended to change the city seal. The city seal, the new one was adopted last October. I get to go for that session and it's gorgeous. The seal looks fantastic and now has a picture of the town hall, which is a beautiful building in the middle of it. And then they also made a recommendation. They ended up recommending to change 12 street names. All 12 were adopted and changed by the city council last October. So they're rolling out, I think they changed them effective January 1st to actually roll that out. So I think in terms of a process that worked really well, I think this was one where the community learned as a whole, the stakeholder group learned, and I thought we gave some opportunity set up the stage for some reconciliation to happen within the different parties. And that was followed by a process that I don't think went as well. And so this is one to change. We got asked to look at changing the name of Lee Highway and Lee Jackson Memorial Highway in Fairfax County. Arlington had changed Lee Highway, Loudoun has changed it. So we were asked to look at this. And I will say, we tried to do something quite similar in terms of we had a stakeholder group that was pulled together. One of the differences is the Board of Supervisors got to select who was on this group. And I think they selected the people that had been the loudest, as opposed to the people they thought could necessarily contribute to a good conversation, thoughtful conversation. It was also complicated by the fact that while this entire process was happening, we had Board of Supervisors members coming out making public statements that there should be change made. So there was a understandable, not everyone in the community believed that this was a real process, and that was understandable. They thought that the writing may be on the wall and the decisions were made. From my perspective, I understood it to be a legitimate process, that we were really pulling together recommendations. But I think there was, because of how this was playing out with these elected officials, I think there was legitimate skepticism amongst the community about whether or not what we were doing was real and true. The other thing that's true is that we were asked to run this process using kind of Robert's Rules of Order and very formal decision-making structures, which was horrific. And we finally had to do some negotiation with the partner that was working with me on this to make some changes to that, but we were only able to change so far. It was also chaired by someone who, there's also a chair of the group who wasn't us. So we had a very complicated dynamic with this community member who'd been asked to chair this group. Which this was also a political action for her, right? and had consequences, what was happening at consequences. So, we had task force meetings. We had a subgroup that was looking at community engagement. They created a survey. This is another cautionary tale. I said from the beginning, I was like, the survey that we're putting out is not a public opinion poll. It's not going to be statistically valid. You're not going to be able to say 65% of the community wants this and that. We're not doing that. That's not, we're putting out a feedback instrument, not a public opinion poll. And I said it from the beginning, and I continued to try to say it. Not surprisingly, once the results came back, the people who the results came back on their side chose to frame it very much as a public opinion poll, saying 64% of the community didn't want there to be any change in these names, which I don't think actually reflects the opinion of the community. I think it reflected who got their teams activated to fill out the survey potentially multiple times, in all the different ways that we had it. And so that's just something of a process, just a hesitation or concern. I saw it coming and I couldn't get in front of the train on that one to get that reframed. And then we held community listening sessions, which again, we kind of got pushed into having these be sort of that 2 to 3 minute you come talk sort of situation, like a normal town hall or something would do, which is not an effective mechanism for conversation. So in a lot of ways, I think this process, well, a recommendation went forward to change the 2 names, and that recommendation had alternative names associated with it. I actually think this is a process where we left the community worse off. They weren't really able to engage in meaningful conversation. The people who didn't want change felt like it was rigged from the beginning, and I think walked away feeling like they were never heard. I think the activists that wanted change, I'm not sure we're satisfied either, because I don't think we ever really took up or were able to bring into the community the deeper conversation about why this change mattered and why people were looking for it. So, this is one where we got a result, right? I think it was probably the result that everybody predicted we would get. But in terms of actually helping the community grow and learn, I'm not sure we managed to pull that off. So just to share one that I'm not happy about, as well as some of the ones that I think have gone well. We followed this up. We were asked to do a dialogue in Falls Church City. This was a one-off. And Kristen, you were a facilitator for this, weren't you? Do you want to take a couple minutes? Let me take a drink and say something about kind of what we did with this one.
Sure. Yeah, this is a deep dive. This was, oh gosh, yeah, okay, it was a year ago. This was really interesting. I don't remember what the precipitating event was because I was invited at this stage when we were doing the convening. But as we held this particular dialogue, there was some speaking at the beginning from different diverse voices in the community about how an atmosphere of greater racial equity could be fostered in Falls Church City. It was held at a local high school, which I believe you may want to help me out with this, Julie, but the name of that school had recently been changed from a Confederate name. Is that right?
It was Thomas Jefferson and George Mason were the 2 names of schools in Falls Church that changed, and they were changed because they had been slaveholders in a not great process. So it was a fairly bruised community that had just had this name change process go through without much conversation.
Yeah, it felt like a little bit of an ominous backdrop for this particular meeting. Because there were a lot of alumni who were present, a lot of people who had close relationships with the school and their previous names. So it was under that backdrop that we started this particular dialogue. We held this in a World Cafe manner. So there was kind of a beginning session where everybody spoke, and then we split up into small groups thanks, Julie, to discuss these particular questions. And it's interesting because the Fairfax County process and this process kind of were happening around the same time together. And I think that for me, what those 2 incidents had in common was that there was an overtly political element to both of those kind of from the beginning. So there was an opportunity in both of these for politicians to be really really vocal in advancing their own message. In this particular event in Falls Church City, I think I had the mayor, I had the chief of police, like I had all of the politicians in my group, and it became a little bit of a grandstand. So that in mine was a little difficult to manage. But we were able to facilitate some discussion. It just required a little bit more active management than you would if you had kind of a more heterogeneous mix of community members. And I don't actually know how this all ended up, Julie. I know there was some discussion of follow-up or doing additional groups, but I'll let you kind of take back over there.
Sure. Yeah. I think my hope from the beginning was this is going to be conversation one of multiple conversations in this community. And I think, which has not happened. So people walked out and they said they were very happy and this was great. And this was a great conversation. And I felt a little bit like that may have meant that we missed the mark, because I'm not sure that people were uncomfortable enough to have actually really had a hard conversation. I think there was a little too much, like, we've checked the box, we've all covered equity now. And I don't know if you had the same feeling.
It was very short. It was very well attended by people who were very influential in the community, and there was clearly an effort made to make an appearance and to show up and take part. And, I agree. I really felt like this could have been the beginning of kind of that trust building between the different community members, and it's disappointing to hear that nothing else came from that.
Yeah. So thanks, Kristen. Thanks for sharing that, or sharing with that too. So just a couple, I'm not going to talk about each of these, but Kristen's been working with me in Fairfax High School for about a year now, working actually it's a follow-up to something that Community Relations Service did, where they did a Spirit Day where the students were able to identify issues they had around equity, and pull together a group of students who are trying to come up with how they want to change what's happening in their school building. So we've been working on that. More recently, I was working with Arlington County again on a community process to identify if they wanted to have kind of permanent virtual learning options in the schools, doing some work with, so coming out of some of this, we've had some elected bodies who've said we could use some help. We're having trouble having good conversations, around kind of strategic issues. So some work there. And then there's been quite a bit of work for the last, I don't know, 7 or I guess almost 8 years now around IEP meetings and having external facilitators and kind of working through community kinds of processes that we're still continuing to think about. But let me just kind of conclude with a couple of thoughts that I've been thinking about as kind of some structural differences as we think about processes. I mentioned this before, but who convenes? Is it the elected body? Is it someone on staff? Is it, I've also done work for some of the NGOs that have been, working in the area trying to do things, because that matters, and it changes some of our structures around what we're able to do in terms of conversation, who needs to be involved, whether things have to be public meetings, trying to do a conversation where people are really doing the trust building work that you need to do when it has to be an open meeting can be a little daunting. We've been able to do it, but it just takes a lot of work to think through how do we facilitate allowing people to be vulnerable, while at the same time knowing any member of their community who hasn't been part of this process at any point in time could walk in and be aware of what's going on. So I think that's important. Public versus private information. I've done lots of dancing around not creating public meetings by accident in emails and things like that. Who's doing the decision making afterwards? So all the processes, well, most of the processes we talked about have been about making a decision. That Falls Church one was not, right? It was really just about a dialogue. So who's doing the follow-on decision making, and recognizing that when we're running a community process, we are often then turning it over to elected officials who are just going to do a whole nother set of things, right? They have public hearing processes and things like that they need to do. What role we play in the selection of the group and overall design. So I have learned to negotiate more strongly, to have a significant role in the selection of the group. And what are some of the concerns I have in terms of parameters around the process design, and happy to talk more about that. Co-chairs or co-facilitators. I found that co-facilitators have been very helpful, and having the students participate has been super helpful also. And then are we talking about specific decision points, or are these community building? Are they something in between? And real clarity on that, right? Because not everybody coming into the room always knows what we're up to. So just being, as clear as possible. And then again, the amount of flexibility we have in the process design that we're working with. I actually put this list together here with the students of Malta because the class I'm teaching with them is about how to do community conflict resolution, right? And so we were trying to think through all these different areas, but as we're thinking, as someone who's being come in to do this design, and like I said, I do a ton of intake. It's a lot of conversation on the front end with everybody who is going to be involved kind of in a meaningful way. But what's the scope? What's my purpose and what's my timeline? Some of these community processes, there's so much pressure on the elected officials that they're under such pressure that they're trying to get things done in timelines that are not reasonable, right? So you're not going to have a really good community discussion on a really tough issue and have a recommendation in 3 months. Like it's not going to happen. So, negotiating for the space and really having the conversation to think about how much time do we need. Also awareness, though, that some of these issues are driven by budget cycle. So the Arlington Police Review, for instance, the deadline we had was because the county manager had to get any changes into his upcoming budget if he was going to have to allocate resources to make those changes. So just being aware of what some of the things that are happening outside us. The membership of the group, and I'll talk more about that, but decision making, how the group makes decisions. So I usually try to have the group have a conversation about how they're going to make decisions. Are they going to do majority rules? Are they going to work with consensus? Are they using some kind of super majority? Most groups will say they want to work by consensus, and then I usually ask them to make a backup plan because they may not necessarily get to consensus, and what are they going to do if they don't and they need to put forward a recommendation? So we just try to open that conversation. Location and arrangements of the meetings. So a lot of these have been virtual, but I was doing police community dialogues pre-pandemic. And the first thing the police department said is, well, we can use our conference space at the police station. And I said, no, we can't. We're not going to use that space, right? You're not going to bring in community that already doesn't have trust in you into the police station. So we worked with the local, some of the local NGOs to find I think it was a moose lodge that was within the walking distance with the community they wanted to work with, that people could walk to and wasn't the police station and was going to feel familiar and comfortable. So thinking about, what's the location? How are we arranging rooms? All those kinds of things. How are we structuring conversation? Is it whole group, small group combinations? I do usually some combination of kind of circles where everyone gets a chance to talk, but then also, more open conversations that are not always very structured. Not thinking about how your comfort level is for people to disagree with each other and just being okay with that. Not creating structures that are going to stifle conversation, but actually allow it to be there and allow people to put issues on the table. Do we have formal rules that we're following? So some of these decisions are driven by larger processes, whether they're state legislation, those kinds of things that we're worried about. The convener and the host, who's sponsoring. One of the advantages I think that we have as the Carter School and in our roles is that as a university, we can convene things that open up different kinds of conversations. So I can stand in the front of the room and ask a question that would be quite different if someone who worked for a city or a county asked that question. Thinking about whether or not we have elected officials participating in the processes at all, right? Because if a decision maker's in the room, now we're no longer probably having a conversation. Now everything's being directed to try to influence that decision maker. So thinking about, those roles and playing with them intentionally. Where we have external actors. So one of the things that for sure happened in Fairfax County is that there was this whole narrative about this whole thing being driven by a externally funded group. It was a little bit of conspiracy theory as well, but we did have external actors intervening in the process. But also where we might need experts. So where can we bring in external folks who are bringing expertise that levels the playing field for the groups? Current relationships between the groups, identities of facilitators. This matters obviously in terms of who we are, both kind of visually, what we represent and who people are comfortable with, but also in terms of kind of what spaces we're able to inhabit. And then some clarity on outcomes and next steps, right? So one of the things that is often true is that these groups need to be clear that what they're doing is creating a recommendation that is going to go through some other kind of decision process. so that they're not voting to make change. They're voting or they're promoting a recommendation to make change, but just to set the expectations for them that there's next steps. A couple thoughts just on kind of membership of the groups. One of the questions that I've been kicking around a little bit is how to include, for instance, police officers in groups that we're looking at police practices, right? We need their expertise and their opinion, but to what extent are they able to participate, as group members versus should be coming in as subject matter experts? When we did the SRO group, we had a couple SROs participating actively, and I think 2 of them were able to see the broader context and understand why we were having the conversation. And I think for 2 of them, they felt kind of personally threatened. Not surprisingly, we're talking about the role and the career that they've been playing, and it was really hard for them to participate in that way because of that kind of identity threat. And so just paying attention to that. I mentioned earlier kind of how young people work. Young people can be fantastic. Young adults can be fantastic for, I think, leveraging some adult stubbornness potentially, right, with them actually bringing perspectives into the room. But we have to make sure we're creating spaces that are safe for them. Thinking about group size, how direct versus organic. There's a variety of questions in here that we can talk about. That's kind of what I had to just talk through. And so we've got, about 30 minutes if we want to open up for questions or broader conversation. Happy to just kind of chat about it. I'd be interested if you've got some lessons learned around doing this from process you've been a part of also. So I will open up the floor, and you can feel free to raise a virtual hand or a live hand, or just come off mute, whatever makes the most sense to you. Georgia, go for it.
Hi, thank you so much, Julie, for the presentation. I just wanted to call out you mentioned this twice and emphasized it, but just like in talking the point about not having people start from their positions in a couple of those processes that went well, like not trying to put people like on the record or have them like say their opinion or a position that then they might lock into like trying to defend. I think that's a big part of doing consensus process with groups that live together, which, they quote the thing of consensus is the worst process in the world, except it's better than anything else that, we've figured out so far. But really starting from values as the way to unlock the ability to achieve consensus, because then you don't have people talking about, you're running the air conditioning and destroying the environment because you hate the environment and you're, want everyone to die of heat stroke. You're saying, what are our values? Our values are like, we care about the environment and our neighbors and their health, right? And then being able to move forward from that perspective. So I just wanted to notice that and call that out as being actually like really huge, and just like something about human psychology and the way that we operate.
Do you have particular questions that you've used, Georgia? I mean, I use often a value in the community. What do you value in the community? How do you know that you belong? Are there other kind of questions that you've used that have gotten to that?
I mean, the thing about working with intentional communities is hopefully kind of to your point about like developing co-conspirators or like doing the developmental approach, like the goal really is to work yourself out of a job. And so there is a lot of, at least for me in the way I approach it, trying to teach the group how to self-manage some of these things, so that like even if 2 people are getting into it or there's something heated enough, there might be enough people in the room who can kind of bring that perspective or ask these questions and help each other. So at that point you can start to tell people and like train your group in the skill of listening for values, like explicitly, and say, okay, nice. I just heard, Tim say, I walked into the common house and it was 30 degrees and I think this, that, or the other, and say, okay, I want someone to help me out. Can you please tell me what you heard Tim say and what values you heard, and ask people to do that process work. Cool. Otherwise, I've had some success with doing like physical activities, also like an agree-disagree wall, and kind of asking questions and then being like, what did you notice? People saying like, oh, half our group was all the way on the agree wall on this question, like clearly that's important to them, and kind of using different ways to ask people this question and get them in that mode But it is, you do have to kind of break people out of the debate mode because we're trained into that so much in school and in work and in life. So I think, I don't know if, like, if you just ask people, what are your values? That's not always the most useful, but I saw an interesting activity about this actually from a group called the Interactivity Foundation. I could maybe forward to you. I don't know if I could, like, I was reading a thing about it and it was about digging into values and it was really interesting. So I can maybe find that link here.
Yeah, I'd love that. Yeah, I'm totally very interested in tools, particularly, now that there's more combination of more combination in person and online, thinking through how do we manage those. So no, I love additional tools and things that would be fantastic. Thanks. Ashton.
I appreciate this this really great overview of the work that you and others have been courageously and thoughtfully bringing forward. One question that I wanted to bring up, so I was the one that mentioned transportation as a site of urban conflict, and there are actually, I mean, if you take a racial lens to it, it is so multi-layered and nuanced that it would take me another hour to get into sufficient details on that. But what I wanted to ask about is, let's say, for instance, that we think about race and transportation. I live in DC, where a lot of folks have been displaced because of structural inequities from a housing perspective, economic development perspectives. And so we have longstanding communities of color that are moving to the suburbs. These folks are coming into DC to, let's say, attend church service at the church that they grew up going to when they lived in DC. Yet, they're driving, which is putting, coincidentally, people of color at greater risk of vehicular violence because Black residents and other folks of color are disproportionately vulnerable to that. They also are less likely to have access to a vehicle. And so there was a really interesting debate that erupted in DC. I want to say it began in somewhere between 2012 and 2015 about, proposed bike lane in front of a church that only had members coming in once a week for 2 hours on Sundays. The question that I want to bring to you is, I think you spoke really, clearly about how the community was defined, or at least, brought together for this. But with transportation, part of its inherent value is the fact that it connects across vast differences, and our idea of who's impacted by decisions that are made about even one bus stop. You could even boil it down to, like, the bus stop on the corner next to your house. Have ramifications across much broader geographic area, and touch people as they move about the world in different identities and in different social positions and for different reasons, et cetera. How would you think about defining the relevant or valid stakeholders when you're thinking about, okay, we have folks from Fairfax driving to DC to go to work. Do they have a stake in how we think about investments that we are making in transportation infrastructure? Or is it the folks that are still here? And that's, even without the, the kind of layer of racial identity put on top of it in decades and generations of systemic inequality that have really warped how these issues in a lot of spaces are being talked about. Hopefully that made sense.
It does, and I think it's a really good question. We had a little bit of this when we were trying to do the police review, because looking at, for instance, traffic stop data, right? Like Arlington County is in between everywhere in DC, in Virginia. So, a lot of the traffic stop data is not necessarily about Arlington residents, or, so I think we had a little bit of it. I think it's a really important process design question. And this is, where I didn't talk about it as much, but really spending, part of that intake is also trying to do the stakeholder mapping and figure out who we really need to have involved in the conversation. And I think negotiating for some leverage to how to make sure that you're bringing those voices in. Like if somebody's asking you to run a process, right? To say, this is going to need to go beyond, I'm going to need to find ways to bring this conversation to a broader group of people. And then think about how do we get feedback mechanisms, right? Because you're probably not going to get the person who drives an hour and a half outside of the city to go home to come back in for a session at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday night. So thinking about where can we actually go get that data, or who could represent those perspectives. So I think it's really important. And I would have, in general, a fairly broad brush on who I would consider stakeholders. Recognizing though that then that might be a different constituency than the people who are going to be the one paying the taxes for the decision that's getting made. And so I think I think bringing that forward and being explicit about it, and saying we need to make sure that we're including all the stakeholders, maybe how their voices are included looks a little bit different than the people who are going to be long-term having to live with the financial, they're coming up with the money or because they're the residents. But I think it's a really important piece that we're not, we're very interconnected and not geographically bound in a lot of ways. And I also really appreciate your point about the questions that may look like they're transportation or fairly kind of technical often have really deep layers, and represent a lot of deep layers. So I don't think that's necessarily an answer, Ashley, as much as a reflection. I think that that's a really good point. And as we're process design folks, we have to be really thinking about how do we reach all the stakeholders who are involved, and sometimes in super creative ways. Thanks so Laura, much. Laura, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was actually a little curious. So I saw that you were mentioning a program, a project you're working on with Arlington County Public Schools about the school resource officers. And I do remember when I was working, I worked with a lot of kids in high school. Some of them were involved in juvenile justice, and quite a few would have a narrative. I'd come from a meeting and they'd start talking about the school resource officers following me around. They know what's going on. They have access to records. And now this guy's making it known that he knows about me. And a lot of times in certain communities, you would find that these school resource officers actually did work for the police station, and they were in the community, and they would see these kids outside and make a point to notice them. And instead of the kids feeling like it was encouraging, they did not feel like it was encouraging at all. They felt it in that sense. So my question, you said that you had 27 students that were kind of convened together. I know sometimes high school can be representative of like how systems work for adults in the larger community. And I found that anytime, we found that kids in high school were convened or there was any sort of feedback, it was always from certain students that faculty or staff felt like they had access to, kids who were high achievers, kids who were involved in clubs. And those kids aren't necessarily the ones that maybe they are, maybe they're not having some of those contact with some school resource officers. I was kind of curious to see how that process of soliciting those students went about, and B, if these students felt like they got a process in which they did feel like they can, be part of processes in the future, because I guess this kind of, is an experience that's gonna shape how you might communicate with your community in the future and stuff.
Yeah, I think those are a set of really good questions. And I'm going to get Kristen to weigh in after. I'm going to take a stab at it and then get Kristen to weigh in and talk about what we've been doing with, I think, Fairfax around that. But it was a really big question about, how do we recruit? We did reach out to some counselors and some of the alternative high schools. There was definitely that, and we still ended up with a group that is mostly the usual suspects, I think, in terms of who the high schoolers were for Arlington, right? Because they're the ones who feel confident to access that. They did then go do, they went in. So maybe to also say that, so one of the things that we did is that the adult that they were getting a chance to interact with was just me. So they weren't in their conversational spaces where they had people in their school in there, which I thought was important so that they could have real conversation with each other and not necessarily have a teacher come back and say, well, I heard you say, this thing. But we did do some intentional outreach, and I don't think it was enough to really get past the usual suspects. You didn't ask this question, but I actually want to highlight, I think the data question was huge. There was a lot of contention around what data are the police officers getting on the kids, and who's giving them the data and when should they be getting the data. So that was something that, yeah, just to maybe highlight from your point that I think was really big and important. The group in Fairfax that we've been working with more recently, the stakeholder equity group, we have been very intentional and worked with a lot of the teachers there to identify the not your usual suspects kids. So not the kids who are on the leadership team, not the kids, and the kids themselves have identified missing voices. So they're trying to get representation from the community of students that are English as a second language learners. So because the kids themselves were like, here's a group that we see is not represented in the group. And so it again is imperfect because there was a couple of activated communities of students who were very interested in being involved. But very few, I think, of these kids are in more formal leadership roles in their school already, and intentionally not that. Maybe Kristen, you can maybe say a little bit about what you've seen with that group. I think it's worked better, is I guess where I'm going with that. Still not perfect, but I think it's worked better.
I agree. I think the intentionality behind it at the beginning with really selecting students and demonstrating through that selection process that their input was being intentionally sought was kind of foundational to building that kind of a group. As the process has worn on, I do think a little bit of an, I hate to say inevitable, but let's say familiar pattern is emerging where the students who already have not only existing relationships with administration and teachers, but also kind of an elevated comfort level in dealing with and conversing with adults and interacting with systems, like those voices are starting to become a little bit more louder. Like they're always the first ones to volunteer to report out. You know, as the group has become, you know, doesn't really quite run itself yet, but they've taken a little bit more responsibility for the activities of the group. Those patterns have been able to be elevated a little bit. The last time we met last week, actually, and Julie, you and I haven't debriefed on this yet, but they did get an opportunity to speak. Their administrators ran the meeting, which is the first time that that's happened since we convened, where representatives from the school, particularly the administrator, was present for the entire meeting. And it was interesting hearing their perspective. Some of the students were really hoping that they could open the group wide open, and anybody who was interested would be able to join. And, you know, we pushed back on that a little bit and explained why that wasn't ideal. So, you know, their perspective on it is a little bit different, but trying to be really intentional and mindful about choosing which voices are present and going through that process of identifying who's missing is important. And also, one of the things that they pointed out in our most recent meeting was, you know, the students said that they had hoped that they would build closer relationships with the people who are on the team. And my bias here is that that's kind of a structural problem. You know, they only meet every couple of weeks. Even though there's a designated core group of students, they meet during kind of an alternative resource time where some of the kids are not able to attend every week. And I think it would be interesting if we could look at, you know, a day-long facilitated kickoff event at the beginning of the school year or something where they really get to dig into the work, because in the 45 minutes to an hour that we have, it's hard to get them in, get them focused, let them dig deep for, you know, 25 minutes and then dismiss them. And I think that that's kind of stopped that building of the group dynamic. And I think that's a separate process from the identity selections that we made or that were made when composing the group.
The other thing I would add, because I actually think this is really important, is we've spent a lot of time with that group in particular. I didn't get this deep with the Arlington group, but having them work, they're doing all of their own advocacy. We told them up front, we're not going to talk to the administrators on your behalf, right? You're coming up with what are the issues you have, what are the potential solutions, and spend a lot of time talking with them about how do you actually create change who needs to be, if you're going to try to make this change happen, who do you need to work with? Who needs to be involved in it? And so I think to the point, Laura, about like, how is this preparing them for the future? I think we've tried to be really intentional about, this isn't them just giving feedback and then the adults are going to go fix this thing, right? It's how do we preparing them to work in with outside of institutions and structures to identify patterns to make change and advocate for yourself. I think this particular school has had a couple of walkouts and things where students kind of didn't know what to do, right? So they all show up outside and do a walkout, and which I think, they feel the solidarity and it raises issues and it's important. But they were having trouble making that, okay, so then who do I actually need to work with if I'm trying to get a change made in my school? And so we've spent a lot of time on that, which I think is I think it's a huge capacity building component for them to then take into the future of as opposed to just standing outside the system or complaining about how the system's working, how do I actually go through the process of change, and recognizing that we are probably not going to completely overthrow the system, even though we might like to, right? Like that there's the school system is still going to need to have some kind of discipline function, right? The school is still going to need to have standardized tests that they report to, but where can there be change, and how do you move it through a system? So I think that's been an important piece. So yeah, it continues to be a work in process and learning.
I just want to mention one more thing about that I feel like was important. I feel like I don't feel like the system was prepared to open up to the change that the students might want to be able to foster. I mean, we look at different types of power, and access to and knowledge of resources is definitely a type of power that the administration holds. And so one of the things that we've kind of observed is the students will come to the administration with a suggestion that they've kind of articulated and fleshed out, and they have their action plans, and then they bring it to the administrator in this case, and she's like, oh, well, you just need to call so-and-so. You just need to just send her an email, send so-and-so an email. And there's kind of this implication that the student should have already known that. And it's not an encouraging process for the students. So having the administrators who invited this process and initiated the organization of this process really be prepared for a number of eventualities of how the students might want to make this change, both what changes they might want, because I haven't yet heard a request for overthrowing standardized tests, although I would be first in line. But some of the requests, for instance, really toe the line of confidentiality regarding discipline. Students are looking for follow through and follow up regarding how some students were handled when they've perpetrated racially sensitive offenses. And the administration is not able to follow up and provide details about how those students were punished, for instance. A little better preparation on the part of the administration. I think the next time we do this might be better, kind of an opening session to make sure that they're prepared to listen with curiosity to the student suggestions and really be softened to potentially enabling some of those, and really letting down that defensive posture, I think, has been one of the hardest structural things about this experience.
Thanks, Kristen, for adding that. Georgia, do you want to put something in the chat about thinking a lot about how we learn to advocate? Did you have any other thoughts you wanted to share on kind of how we're trying to help folks learn to advocate and build their own skills?
Sure. I mean, I know I'm gonna have to go in a minute here, and I know other folks probably do as well. It's something you said earlier, Julie, about kind of like the roles, like coming in as a facilitator and not like an advocate role, but kind of holding space for the conversation to happen. And so I think maybe just due to like reasons of my background or personal reasons, I've just been thinking a lot lately about how they are two different sort of mindsets and skill sets and ways of operating, of like advocating and pushing people and coming in with a position and saying like, this has to change in this particular way, right? And that's something that people make their whole career and their whole life, their life's work, whether or not they're paid for it in money, out of doing that. But I think in our society, we have less of an appreciation for the set of skills that it takes to hold the conversation. And it's a different way of operating to say this is a problem and we clearly need to address it, but but not to have a position, like that can even be seen as being weak or being wishy-washy, of saying we're not going to have a predetermined position, we're not going to advocate for it, but we're going to hold the space for the conversation to happen and see what happens. But I think that's also very deep kind of work. And like you were saying, they reinforce each other, but they don't operate in the same way. And so I've just been thinking a lot about that myself.
Yeah. And I think one of the elements of that I have found sometimes challenging is when we're being complicit in a system that's not working, right? Like when working with a system to make change is problematic ethically, because now it's complicity in supporting the system. So, I think that this is and I think this has been a tension in the field too, right? I mean, I think we have folks who would say that, if you're talking about race and equity issues, there's right and there's wrong. It's not a community conversation, right? Like justice is justice. So you can't negotiate. And I think that that's I think that that's a meaningful perspective. So I do think that there's some, I don't think these are unchallenging to figure out how to position ourselves in our roles. And, I've turned down a couple processes that I didn't think were, or a couple asks to facilitate processes because I didn't think that they were actually either real processes or really had the intention of opening up spaces, which I think is important. So I do think that there's a set of tricky role questions in here that I don't want to diminish. Yeah, I think Lydia was asking in the chat about how do you maintain a neutral position when facilitating. I don't think I'm ever actually neutral. I certainly I don't think there's any way to completely help anything, at my own perspectives from bleeding in. I do try to honor the process and perspective, and to say I'm designing a process which should allow people to have opportunity to speak. I try to look for where I might be falling into. We have a student, for instance, who I think is a little bit of an over talker, and he's a white guy, and that's just kind of okay to be a white guy that's an over talker, right? And figuring out how we're not just allowing some of those kind of systematic, things to continue. So I do think, I think it's a focus on honoring process and perspective, and then trying my best to not have, the pieces of me that are very opinionated about some of these topics slide in. But it's hard because they slide in words, they slide in which expert you choose to bring to talk about something, right? And what perspective they're sharing. So yeah, I think not striving for neutrality, but striving for holding a fair process, of one in which people at the end of it may not want that outcome, but at least they'll feel like they're heard is what I'm working towards. So thanks. I think it's a tough question. Yeah. So I know we're at the end of our time. Thanks for being here and being part of Peace Week. I think the video will be up, in the next couple weeks, and I will send slides out to I'll have see if Amber can send the slides out to everybody who was signed up for today. So thank you very much.